Right, room's open.
All right. Let's see. I'm going to join the webinar from my other computer. And looks like we have people coming in. All right. Well, welcome everybody. We're going to give folks a minute or two. It just takes about 60 seconds for everybody to log in. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in a minute. And it looks like in chat we have somebody from Winnipeg. So thank you. All right. How about 30 more seconds here? Sorry, I'm looking at the side. I just have a second computer going to make sure everything's working fine. All right. Well, let's see. I think we get started. So welcome everybody. My name is Brian Meyer. I'm really excited about our presentation team that we have today. Laura Kern from University of South Florida, and Feinberg, University of Connecticut, and Rachel from the Kentucky Department of Ed. We've been discussing for months now, Rachel and I, on how we want to shape this conversation on restraint and seclusion, and we've cobbled together some amazing people to help. And special thanks to Diane Lamasser, who's going to be our tech assistant. So I'm not too concerned about our expectations for today. Just please be respectful in chat, be engaging, pay attention, and we'll have a great session. Remember that there are questions. You can ask questions of us in the polls tab. You'll see the opportunity there. Please put your questions there throughout. And then at the end, Adam will help us navigate those questions and we'll pull some out to discuss at the end. So we're going to talk about restraint and seclusion in general, put it in its context. We'll talk about how multi-tiered approaches may help educators be more effective. We really have an opportunity to learn about the latest information on state level data and policy examples. Laura is an expert on that and just updated again, I think every minute if you ask her, she has some new data for us on what we can see across the country. And then Rachel's going to share her experience at the State Department in Kentucky and what they've been doing on this subject as well. So that's our presentation team. You'll hear from all of us. Let me just start out with a little bit of my background. I worked in residential education for many years prior to working with the Midwest PBIS network. I have personal experience facilitating both restraint and seclusion. We had a very difficult population, yet at the same time, we took it very seriously. We reviewed every incident. We analyzed what could have been done to have prevented the incidents. That was a required step of our procedures. And we never used either practice as a form of punishment or because there was non-compliant behavior. It was always done because of imminent, immediate threat of physical harm. Yet, all these years later, I reflect back on it and I ask myself, could we have done better? And I know we could have. And I'm very passionate about this subject for those reasons. So I want to do better, and I think we all do as well. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'm excited to share with you what we've learned as we continue to research this restraint and seclusion. So a little background information is always great. We have 2015-16 data here, and last night, 9 p.m., Laura said, hey, new report available with, I think, data from 17-18. I posted that report in the files tab, but the core information is the same, which is there are a significant number of restraints and seclusions that take place all across our country. And of course, there is disproportionate impact for students with disabilities. So in 15-16, they represented 12% of all school students, yet where 71% of the students restrained and 66% of the students secluded. That is, I think, both predictable and shocking. I think that's how I would characterize that kind of data. It's important to know what we're talking about. So from a definition perspective, when we're talking about physical restraint, we're talking about immobilizing somebody against their free will. This definition says it does not include physically escorting a student. In my organization, if I had to encourage a student to walk down the hallway because they were a danger to themselves, we actually did consider that restraint. So there's formal definitions, but then there's your local policy and how you define it as well. The point is, if my hands were on a student because that student was non-compliant and a danger to themselves or somebody else, we said, let's call that restraint and treat it accordingly, and therefore we would document the data that way. Seclusion, involuntary confinement of a student in a space where they cannot leave. And there's a lot of arguments about what seclusion is. Some schools have a seclusion room. They tell the students to go in there, but they leave the door open, so they don't have to call it seclusion. Well, can the student really leave? Or are they being told that if they leave, there's bigger consequences? I think schools far too often try to find ways around calling something seclusion when that's exactly what it is. So be mindful of how you define. And we have some examples here just from the definition of when it's restraint versus escort, seclusion versus timeout. I think we err on the side of not documenting way too much across our country. And we sometimes try to call things when they're not. What really comes to mind is this powerful news report out of the Chicago Tribune and ProPublica. If you haven't had a chance to see it yet, there's links to it here on the slide. Look for it afterwards. It's anxiety producing, to say the least, with regard to what they found. And I'm from Illinois, so this hits home. And when you kind of look through the data and what they found, the trends are that 2/3 of the incidences had nothing to do with safety concerns. 1/3 of the incidences that were reported didn't even say why there was a seclusion or a restraint incident. So they didn't even accurately document it. The state was collecting data, but had absolutely no review of the data, so was not giving any feedback on it. And most schools, when they would report the incidences, had no procedure for doing a post-crisis analysis. They didn't sit down as a team and say, so what did we learn about why this happened? So that's some of the data that you'll see in that report. The other thing that really stood out to me, well, two things. One was that schools were pretty comfortable using seclusion as a punishment. A student would say F you to the teacher would say, go to the seclusion room. And then the student would be in there for, well, any time is too long, but a ridiculous amount of time on top of that. That's a good indication right away that there's something not being implemented properly or even being understood. So using it as punishment was one. The other thing that stood out to me is it's probably not uncommon to go into an alternative education setting or a school and to see banners that say we're proud to be a PBIS school, yet those schools still use restraint and seclusion. And a reporter asked me about that. They said, how do you explain that? And I said, well, that's a great question. PBIS isn't saying what practices to use and not to use, but we're saying use the process to ask questions about your data. And we do think that there should be dignity of the student. There's a value base to this work in PBIS. And we want to see our schools asking themselves the hard questions about these practices. But yet there is that reality out there in the field as well. So again, I'm very passionate about it. I'll say that in the past 10 years, 20 years, there have been some pretty important reports that have come out indicating the inappropriate use and excessive use of restraint and seclusion. There is guidance in federal legislation that's pending about preventing inappropriate use of restraint and seclusion. And a lot of those resources are here and are available if you want to refer to them later. I also have a hidden slide in this slide deck that shows a nice timeline as well that some of our national colleagues have put together since the 1950s for this subject. But I'd like to turn to George Sugai, who was our keynote speaker today. And he had an opportunity to sit before the House of Representatives in support of pending legislation. And I have a link to his testimony too in our files, but some of the things that stood out for me, I've read his testimony many times, and there are 4 things that he starts out by saying, which is that all students and educators have the right to a safe, respectful environment. And depending on where you're coming from, you might think, oh, that means me being safe from you being dangerous. It might warrant restraint. Others see that first message and say, no, this is saying that even the student who's acting out has the right to his own dignity and how we respond to that student as well. So that's the intention behind this first statement. The other thing is restraint and seclusion is not therapeutic. It's not an intervention. It's not a practice. Anybody that thinks of it or categorizes it in those ways does not understand the activity. Third, that there are systems and processes for schools to reduce their restraint and seclusion. And fourth, we probably need better policy and we need better legislation around this. A few of the considerations that George shared that I'd like to reshare. Again, it's not restraint and seclusion is not considered treatment or a therapy. And the students who experience it do not learn productive skills. It increases the likelihood that they will continue to have challenging behavior. It maintains a negative and adversarial relationship. It separates them from the function to be effective in their regular environments. And it does not restore environments, but it actually harms relationships. It has all of these negative outcomes. Students who experience restraint and seclusion do not do well in our schools. Likewise, students who demonstrate similarly challenging behaviors, but are responded to through prevention strategies and other methods, are more likely to be engaged in our school communities and have better long-term outcomes. So let me highlight a few overall considerations, and then I'm going to pass this off to Laura next, and she'll talk about policies that we've seen across the country. So, and again, if you have questions that come to mind already, please use the polls tab and we'll go through questions at the end in the last 15 minutes. But let's think about some general big ideas. PBIS is relevant despite our changing world, despite the pandemic, or maybe in direct response to the pandemic, and despite the subject of restraint and seclusion, because it's simply asking these things. What are the outcomes you're getting or that you want? What's the data saying? What are the practices that you're going to use to get the outcomes you want? How are you going to support adults? What are the systems? That's PBIS in a nutshell. A lot of people misunderstand what PBIS is, but that's it. And the only question we have to ask our schools who are challenged by their excessive use or the inappropriate use of restraint and seclusion are you applying the framework to that data? That's the question. And that's the gap that we often have. Also know that there's a cascade of implementation here. There's state level considerations, there's district, regional, there's school, there's classroom, there's student. And one of the things that Adam's going to share later is this idea of saying, well, what does the teaming structure look like, whether you're at the state, the district, or the school? And what are the responsibilities of those leadership teams with regard to restraint and seclusion? And then finally, when we talk about the classroom level, especially the school and the classroom, let's think about this process for supporting our students, which is we need to connect with our students. We have to screen to know who's at risk, who needs more help, who has internalizing needs. We have to provide the support, directly teach the expected behaviors, and then monitor our outcomes. That's that cycle that we expect, and that's embedded in this work that we do for PBIS. Right around the time that George provided his testimony, or maybe right after that, I think we collected some of those same ideas and we published them in a TA guide or a TA brief on pbas.org. That's also available, and you can get to that from the Files tab as well. Questions to think about, and maybe some comments you might want to put in chat. I'm not able to see chat at the moment, but some things you might want to consider. Is your district or school using its PBAS framework specifically to look at restraint and seclusion right now? Which features of the data systems practices are in place in your school to address restraint and seclusion? And what could be improved? So these are great think about questions. If we have time at the very end, we can come back to these and open up the floor for more conversation. But regarding number 2, which core features come up? Let me just highlight what we mean by that. These are the PBAS features. These are MTSS features, especially the ones in bold. And all we're doing at this point, I could have set system features to blank, and you can put your target area to prevent bullying. Could have been your target area, or to increase relationships in our building. But in this case, we're going to say to prevent restraint and seclusion. And so here are the key questions for systems. Is your leadership team representative of your community? And are they looking at this data and this subject? Do you provide professional development for your staff? And does that include teaching your staff how to use successful classroom practices and de-escalation strategies? And what are your policies? Like I said, I was personally engaged in restraint and seclusion from an administrator at a school, and I know we could have done better. And at the same time, we really focused on our policies. We did not take it for granted, and we were constantly reviewing them to make sure that the students were first and foremost in our policies around restraint and seclusion. Practices, here are the core ideas. There's no one thing that works for all students, right? So that's why we need to have tiered practice. That's what we mean when we say have tiered practices. So what are we going to do for all? Well, how will we layer up for students who need more? How will we individualize for students that need the most support in any given area? And the bullet point towards the bottom here, when we're talking about restraint and seclusion, what we're really saying is, are we teaching our students de-escalation strategies and self-regulation strategies? When a student is dysregulated, right, for whatever reason, they're no longer under instructional response. So telling them to do things is not going to be received with following instructions because they're dysregulated. So teaching students during neutral times how to maintain regulation, how to de-escalate when they're feeling anxious, those are the routines and strategies that can help us when the students need and are in crisis. And finally, your data. And this is the part that I think challenges us the most in this area. Are we accurately documenting restraint and seclusion incidences? Are we calling them what they really are? Do we have data decision rules for when students can get more supports in our schools? Are we screening students effectively to know what supports they need? And for all the things we do, all the practices that we do have, the lessons that we do teach, are we checking the fidelity? Are we doing those things the way they're supposed to be done? I've been really focused on the school level. Of course, we know we're proud that we have a lot of state level representatives on this call today or in this session today. So we also need to think about that data as well. But everything that I'm sharing to you is really probably the call to the state to say, what guidance are you providing to your schools in these areas? And while there's some good data points here too, go back to the slide before, especially from that, sliding around, especially from that data perspective, and really dig into some of these items. And this is true MTSS implementation at the school level when we're doing these things. Okay. I hope that's a good general overview for the MTSS logic and how it applies, or the PBAS logic and how it applies to restraint and seclusion. Some good resources there. Laura, you want to take over my screen, and you can take yourself off mute?
Yep.
All right, that's working. We hear you.
All right. All right, let's see if this works.
And Laura, would you introduce yourself briefly too?
Sure. I'm Laura Kern. I work at University of South Florida, and I work for the TA project through USF, the PBIS project. I was a lawyer for a bunch of years, and then my son was diagnosed with autism. So I started to take special ed classes and just kept taking them. until I got a PhD. It was a little crazy. I worked with Jen Freeman and Brandy Simonson and George Sagai at UConn with some of the restraint and seclusion. And then when I got to USF, I worked with Lauren Ivanovich and Heather George and Don Kincaid, and we were doing more of a district level approach to some of the restraint and seclusion. So I'm interested in multiple levels, partly because as a mom of a kid with a disability, this is always a concern that I had, that he would experience restraint and seclusion in schools because of his diagnosis and because he was a boy and everything like that. And he hasn't, but it is just something that I've always kind of thought personally of what a family member would feel as they were going through this. So trying to get the slide to go. Oh, sorry, now I'm going too fast. All right, so I just want to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing at University of South Florida with Lauren Ivanovich, and we had a wonderful GA, Jennifer Hodnett, who really did a lot of the grunt work on this, is that we really wanted to know what was happening for policy and law on restraint and seclusion. So especially for policy, what we did is we had Jennifer go through each state's Department of Education website and look for policies on restraint and seclusion. She gathered a whole bunch of them and then put them in a folder, and then we started to put them kind of in subcategories, and then we coded them across to look for different themes. So we're going to share some of those. I've also been working with the laws and doing the same thing with the law. I just finished the last one yesterday. So we'll sprinkle in a little bit of the law, but the policy one is much more analyzed at this point. This is a resource that we have available for you all, and it lists the policy documents, a description, where they can be found, and the type of resource. We also gathered a whole bunch of stuff that we didn't really consider policy, but they were more like forms, and we thought they'd be really helpful. So part of there's a separate table attached to this document that has just forms that people might be able to use at both the school and the state level to help you guide policy and law in this area. So overall, we wanted to kind of know like what's going on in seclusion and restraint in terms of that law and policy. And it's really spanning a bunch of year period. We just did our thing in 2020, but in 2009, a researcher who's done a lot of work in seclusion restraint did do a look at it. And Jen Freeman and George Sagai did an update, which was tied right around when the Department of Education, the federal one, did their big resource guide, the guiding principles with the 15 key principles. So they did it after that. Marks and Baker followed through a couple years later to see if that federal guidance came out in the legislation. And then we kind of replicated what Jen and George have done. Jen is on our group kind of giving guidance about what to look at. So the overall takeaway for this is that you can see across time from 2009 to 2020, we have more legislation present. Now, some of it's, not wonderful. It might be like, one or two statutes that just basically said, we're working on this, and some are very thorough. But the point is that the states are saying we really need to have laws in this area. If you look at the policy guidance, and this is more, we define this as like documents. I have a precise definition: statements or documents issued by the State Department of Education that set out the state views and expectations related to school district responsibilities and duties. So that's how we define policies, because policy can be kind of a crazy term. And if you look across time, for the most part, we have a little bit of come down from where Marx was, but we do see upward, more states are giving policy in it. And again, we have a trend down for no legislation. Interesting enough, we're kind of stable on the comprehensive TA guidance, which is kind of like that big manual that states often put together on policy and law for seclusion and restraint. But overall, the big takeaway is that we're seeing some really good stuff happening. I don't know why it doesn't want to advance for me. All right, So some of the guiding questions we're going to look at as we go through this is just questions for states to think about, and then that can trickle down into districts and also into the local state level. So overall, I'd mentioned that 32 states have policies, 47 have laws, 2 states have neither. So one of the key things from your point of view is, what does your state have? This is at the school level and at the state level. Do you have any laws on restraint and exclusion? Do you have any policies? Do you know what those are? Because those are going to guide what you're being able to do in the school. So the first thing to do is kind of look for it. If you can't find the laws, feel free to email, and I have them. I can send something to you. But they are available online in the public setting. And then the policies, we do have them listed in the table. So look and see what you actually have. And then realize that some states have provided guidance through different types of policies. Some have provided these overall guides, but then also some have direct tools. So at a school level, if you're asked to do a model policy, look and see if the state has anything already to help you. If you need an incident report form, maybe there already is something that can happen. And states, if you don't have something, maybe think about what your districts or schools would need in order to carry out the policy.
Hey, Laura, go ahead and click on the window again.
Okay.
And then try to advance.
All right. That worked. Hopefully that'll keep working. All right. So overall, if you look at the type of policies that we were looking at, we had a number of states had the comprehensive technical assistance and then the technical assistance guidance, which we actually included frequently asked questions, not as intense as a comprehensive, but still really good guidance. So these are really strong indicators that we're having some good state policy guidance. We had some that looked at data reporting. So helping local people figure out what data you need to put in and where to put it. We had the model policy, which is kind of like if you ask a local school to put a policy in place, that the states are helping with that. Policy memos might be interpretation of small areas of the law, and then just other. So here's a really awesome work that Virginia has done. This is a TA comprehensive guidance in our coding. And they really looked at restraint and seclusion, how the law is carried out in Virginia. I love what they did because they also had some sections in the beginning that talked about, here's how to bring a policy in place. Here's where to work with the stakeholders. They talked about the process of bringing that law into policy and then what they would like to see in Virginia. So they did a really wonderful job with it. The other thing to start thinking about is who's in charge of making these policies and what TA would be needed from the states to be successful. So in some laws, the state legislators are being very specific and they have, here's what we would like to see in restraint and seclusion. In other times, they're saying, we're going to delegate it. We might just actually directly delegate it and say, we're not even going to do statutes, or we might kind of have both. And we're going to say the State Board of Education is going to make the regulations. I kind of like that because a lot of times it's people who are working in schools and people at the state level, but that is where we're kind of looking at it. The other thing, and this I was very surprised to see, is that sometimes the legislators say, we are going to have the school and local boards of ed do the policy. Now that to me is tough because you're asking the schools, here's the statute, here's the law. Now you guys make the actual on the ground policy decisions. So if you're somebody from the state and you're hearing that and you know your state is doing that, what kind of TA support would you need to provide for the school local level to put that policy in place? So Indiana has done a really great job at this. They have tons of regulations. They have a Commission on Seclusion and Restraint in Schools, and they've come up with a wonderful TA guidance on model seclusion and restraint plan. Again, these are available in that table. Other states have also done the same, where they really have said, okay, we're asking you to do this, but we're going to give you a model that you can then work with at first to make sure you hit all the requirements of the law. Some other things to think about are, again, I'd asked you if your state has a policy or law on restraint exclusion, but what's in that policy? So this is kind of like, what are we asking our schools to do? For example, Brian had mentioned that from George and his own experiences, that you're really only supposed to use restraint and seclusion in emergency situations. And the federal document I had mentioned before with the 15 principles really highlighted that it should only be used for imminent danger. Well, I don't know about you guys. Imminent is not a word that my friends and I use. We don't use that. If I had to text that to Adam, it's not going to even, it's going to correct it into something weird because it's not a common word. One of the states flipped it to immediate, which I thought was a little bit better than imminent. But what does that mean? Like, how are we defining that? We say, don't do this, but what are we not supposed to do? So what kind of TA can we provide on those definitions? But then also, when this is happening to an individual kid in an individual school, my friend always said, she worked in an alt-ed school as a teacher, and she always said, I want you to always think through the lens with discipline that the kid could be throwing a chair at you while you're trying to make these decisions. So it's great if you're talking about like definitions and policy and procedures, but think about that teacher in that individual situation who has to make that last minute decision. So what kind of training are we doing so they understand what imminent is and techniques that they can use? But think about all those levels of policy, not just that we have a definition and we've provided that to our school staff. Brian had mentioned that the difference between seclusion versus timeout and physical restraint versus escort. And I know in Florida, we have some issues sometimes because like restraint versus escort, what does that mean? And, we provide them the definition, but does that really help them with the actual determining what to do in the actual settings? The other thing is that seclusion is called different things across the state. So say you bring in a consultant who uses the term seclusion, but the state is not using it. For instance, Tennessee uses the term isolation. Isolation means seclusion. And if somebody's talking about seclusion, don't do it or whatever, there might be a disconnect. So you also want to think about what your state is calling these terms and making sure that you understand it and you're providing TA guidance. And at the school level, you understand what these terms mean. So the other thing, again, is at a more universal across the schools level, do we have guidance for what data should be collected? So many states have requirements by statute. So they might ask for overall types of data. For instance, they might ask for total incidents, and that seems to be what we're seeing the most. Or they could ask for number of students, and a couple of states have done that. Kansas has asked, I think, asked for both. The one thing I want to mention for that from a TA point of view is that if you're collecting total incidences, what's happening to the kids who might be getting multiple restraints over and over again if you are just looking at the overall number? The reason why I say that is because we had a district we were working in, which is a smaller district in Florida, and they had been tapped to sort of get monitored to work with us because the restraints were higher. Well, all of a sudden their restraints dropped. And we of course were like, oh, it's our TA work and they're doing such a great job. Well, it turned out they dug a little deeper and one student moved out of the alt-ed setting and into another district. And their restraint numbers looked much better because they were looking at the overall total incidence. But in reality, if they dig deeper, they would find out that there was a kid who really needed some behavioral support. Now, if that kid moves to another district where there's a lot more kids, they might be hidden all the way through that they need the actual support. So just think about what our data is saying and what we can use for it. The other thing is disaggregation. So some of the states are asking, I think Delaware and I believe Washington will say, we really want to have more details when you turn data into us for gender, race, ethnicity, disability status. But that really wasn't always the norm. And as Brian had said in that first couple of slides, we know there's a disproportionate impact where these kids are getting it more. And if we're not collecting it, how do we know? We're not necessarily going back to that federal data and looking at it. So how do we know at the state level what's happening? How do we know at the district level? And then how do we know at that local level? Are we collecting that information and thinking about it? So on this one, this was really great. Ohio did a really nice job of looking at they provided some really good information for the people in the district and the state on who can report. Just like it wasn't even policy, it was just a really good example of a form of working with the districts. Sorry, having problems with that. Okay. So Oregon and North Carolina, another really great examples for discipline incidents, collection manual, and data reporting, and providing a little bit more about the data, but also giving ideas of where to submit data and what to do. Again, really great TA work that then reaches that local level. So the other question is, does the state suggest any approaches or alternatives for using seclusion and restraint for students? So oftentimes we think of kind of PBIS as that magic bullet. We just put PBIS in place and our restraint and seclusion will go down. All our disciplines will go down. But is there TA connected with that? And Adam's going to talk a little bit more about that and unpack what that means. But do we have state guidance for anybody on that, on what that is and how it relates directly to using PBIS for restraint and seclusion? So we have a law like New Mexico says less restrictive interventions, including positive behavioral intervention supports or other comparable behavior management techniques. But just saying that and saying you're a PBIS school does not necessarily mean you're going to see a reduction in seclusion and restraint. So here across, this is policy, not the laws, but we did see some promoting of alternatives, which was really great. You could see in-school programs, which might be like peer mediation. You might have suspension, which I wouldn't suggest, but it is an alternative. PBS, PBIS, that was really strong in the policies. A little bit on restorative practices. I was surprised that we didn't see a little bit more on that because that is an alternative to using restraint that some people have advocated for. Staff training on alternatives, which could be conflict management. Staff training on classroom management, which could be like token economy, redirection in the classroom setting. FBA's functional behavior assessment, behavior intervention plan, behavior support plan. Strangely enough, I always think that this should be, you know, across everybody. It's such great practice when you have behaviors that necessitate restraint for all kids. Where I was seeing that more in the law is when we have restraint and seclusion more limited to kids with special education or 504 plans. That's when I was seeing the FBA coming out more. I'd like to see it more across when you have restraint. They did have one law that said if you have a kid that has multiple restraints, it should necessitate getting an FBA and a BSP. So they did connect it with needing more support, but it wasn't as much the norm as I thought it would be. But we did see it come out in response to as an alternative for restraint and seclusion. I just would like to see it more than just for special education kids. And then finally, staff training on de-escalation. De-escalation is one of those key things that we really think would work with in conjunction with PBS to reduce restraint and seclusion. Ohio had a really great emphasis on PBIS in their statute, and they had a really great TA guide that really promoted PBIS, but also connected it again with restraint and seclusion. And Utah had a fabulous guide. This is least restrictive behavioral interventions. It went way beyond crisis intervention, seclusion, and restraint, but it also had classroom management. It had all sorts of great techniques that schools and districts can use to reduce discipline. Really great resource. So finally, the individual. Does the state have requirements for individual student data? So where are we collecting and what are we collecting for that student? And a lot of times it's in an incident report. So this sometimes goes to the state, but often just stays within the local level. And in that incident report, a lot of times the legislation will actually say what you need to collect. It could be what happened before the restraint and seclusion, the event, the duration, who was present. It could be, is there a connection to IEP? Didn't see that as much. Parent notification. So there's specific requirements. The only thing I did not see a lot of was a demographic information, which you would think you'd want to have on that incident report if we want to see if there are other things going on for that student. And then also, is there a connection to a debriefing meeting? So forms are just forms. I don't care if it's an IEP form or whatever form you have. And we've got forms in that chart that you can take and you can put into your schools and districts, et cetera. But what are you doing with that data on that report? Do we have a debriefing meeting? Some policies and statutes specifically have information on how to do that. But if they don't, often that's good practice. And that might be something that a state or a school can start talking about. What are we doing with the data that we collect, and how are we using it? Are we talking to parents? Are we talking to the student? Are we talking to staff? Are we connecting it with an IEP meeting or doing something with it? So here's a really great example of an incident report from Rhode Island. They include the behaviors, de-escalation efforts, follow-up actions, methods of contact for families. So it's a really good example. Again, it is lacking the demographic information, but at least it really has a solid information that you can use to look for behavior patterns. And then Ohio has a really good debriefing form. I mentioned before they have a connection with PBIS. Well, this also has explicit connection here with a BIP or a 504 or IEP plan. So it has all of that together. Come on.
Hey, Laura, we just switched you over because we're gonna about to hand this off to Adam. Sorry, you were moving. Can I just say the resources are amazing, and I don't folks probably have no idea the amount of time that goes into pulling all that together. If you haven't, go to the files tab, get that resource guide that Laura referenced, and then in chat, some folks from a couple different states are excited to share some new resources that they have or other, and so. Yep, we'll grab those and we'll keep adding to it. But there are great colleagues from around the country to learn from. And Laura, thanks for sharing that. Adam, would you introduce yourself too as you get in your section?
Yeah, definitely. My name is Adam Feinberg. I'm from the University of Connecticut. My experience in this area is more around I help support statewide positive behavioral support across the state of Massachusetts, and also help state leaders across the Northeast portion of the United States. I did have experience working at an adult ed school, at an alternative ed school about, God, I don't want to date myself, about over 15 years ago, but where we did a hands-off policy. So it was really interesting to kind of see how that all works. I am going to take over from Laura for a little bit and talk a little bit about when we think about technical assistance, what types of things we want to consider. Laura did a wonderful job speaking to, sorry, I'm just making sure my remote control works. Definitely, great. Laura did a wonderful job speaking to what we want to think about when it comes to policy and linking that to technical assistance. I'm going to speak briefly about just from a technical assistance perspective about things that you might want to consider at all the different tiers. But I think it's always great to go back to the blueprint, and Brian started us off with this. And when we think about this I know many of you, I think it was like 66% of the people, this is your first forums, which is so wonderful. With that, this blueprint image might be a little bit new to you. And this is thinking about as a state or district team, if we're in the yellow, what kind of functions do we want to do to help support our schools or help support our staff? So with that, the implementation functions, those in green that I've highlighted in red, is training or professional development, coaching in technical assistance, and evaluation in how we think about our data. And as Laura kind of provided that kind of overview of policy, she touched on each of these things, which is great. I'm going to kind of dive into each because I think it's a great organizer for what we do and how we support our schools. So when we think about that linking policy to training, it's really important to start off with what are our policies? Is there policies already in our state that provide guidance around how we need to provide training? How we provide some coaching or what data we need to look at. So similar in summary, kind of what Laura was mentioning, 50% of the policies across our states have policies related to PD and training for restraining seclusion. So, I mean, that's really a great start of how we want to start looking at this type of stuff. And even kind of like what is any specific guidance on training or support related to professional development as we're kind of designing this kind of work in our districts, right? So whether PBS needs to be there, or whether we need to have PBIS and something else. So really look at that, and if not, kind of think about best practice, because Laura brought up a bunch of really nice ideas that we might want to consider. So sometimes states have specific guidance. So for instance, the state of Vermont has a lot of lovely, has a nice resource that really kind of outlines kind of where you really should be looking at restraint and seclusion training. So this is just one example. So your state may also have examples, or even have guidance on these are the resources that you want to look at. So consider that when you think about training. In addition to that, I think it's important to really think about this in a couple of layers. One is that of teaching. So thinking about, the professional development and the training that we do, are we teaching our staff, really to think about being proactive and positive first? So are we thinking about all those alternative strategies, and is that in our staff's repertoire at any day, at any time, in all of our routines across the school day, or the time that we're spending with our students? So thinking about the school-wide expectations and related social, emotional, behavioral skills that, if are not in place, that if students don't have certain skills, are they kind of engaging in kind of error responses? Are they engaging in behaviors because they lack certain skills that are needed that we want greater support for? So thinking about self-management, problem solving, right? So teaching I have here twice, and that was purposeful, because I think teaching is such a critical piece. If we can kind of make sure that staff have the skills, and supporting our staff is really one of the best things that we can do, especially in this context. And think about things like de-escalation strategies and techniques. Are we using positive and neutral strategies to support our students, and do staff have strategies that are not reactive but more proactive, in a sense of how they're prompting our students to engage in either self-management or problem solving? So is that part of the PD curriculum, to help staff not only know how to help develop those skills in our students, but also prompt them? Okay. In addition, review, making sure that we're reviewing frequently those behavioral response strategies. So when we have difficult routines, and we know that we're having a difficult time, do we already know what the problem solving strategy is? Especially as staff, when we kind of engage in these strategies, they're very stressful. These crisis response can be really challenging to the staff. So are we thinking, and we think about Kent McIntosh's and the equity work groups work around vulnerable decision points? Are we thinking about those and making sure that we have ways to take a step back and make sure that we are responding in a rational frame, and that we're not being reactive, right? And again, these are tough times. These are kind of quick response. Laura mentioned, think about if someone's throwing a chair, a student might be throwing a chair, right? We want to kind of sometimes make sure that we even practice in a sense of how we respond, and how we count backwards to 3, and think, what are some of those positive talk strategies that we are promoting more of those self-management, or those problem-solving strategies that we want our students to use. So we want to be more inclusive and proactive. So kind of reviewing those and making sure that that's part of our tiered system of support for our staff, right? Redirect. It's very important to think about how we're redirecting a lot of the minor behaviors, so those minor behaviors don't become major behaviors. So do all of our staff have strategies, so when kind of low-level behaviors occur, that they can kind of be inclusive in making sure that that student may need a break, but they stay within instruction modes, and we don't end up excluding them, to the point that they kind of lose instruction, right? So they kind of stay in. So thinking about proximity, public praise, and as always, engaging the student and engaging the families. So having the better understanding of what the student was thinking, what the student's function is, and having a sense of coordinating and supporting with the parents, so we can learn from the parent and their families about what are the unique needs of this student or our students that we need to better understand, and what's part of this context and this history of this student that we can understand and build a better plan. So so think about these areas when we think about our training. Next, I want to kind of talk about that coaching and technical assistance support piece. And I always kind of think about how are we supporting each other. So as we're thinking about the professional development that we have structured, how do we make sure that that professional development and all the skills that we are supporting our staff on get implemented in a way that is effective? And a lot of times we need more practice and more support. So that's where the coaching piece comes in. And I think peer coaching and supervision are the two ways to consider this. So peer coaching is how we can support each other, especially with students that are a little more intensive, that need a little more attention, that a lot of times it's important that there's multiple adults that help support this process, and we can support each other and we can share our knowledge and our experience of what works well, and we can kind of give feedback. So making sure that we are open to that feedback and making sure that we have an opportunity for staff to communicate with each other about what's working well and how we can kind of de-escalate and redirect these types of behaviors as quickly as possible. And then as always, really kind of look and making sure that we're giving time to supervise staff to make sure they're getting support that they need, especially around some of the crisis procedures and de-escalation. It's really important to make sure that we spend time in supporting our staff around this and giving feedback, whether that is with kind of our most intensive needs areas with our students or with all staff. And this is where our data can really come into play. I'm really looking at whether there's the instant reports, are the office discipline referrals, a little bit of both, and really identify where targeted support is needed. So we're looking across our district at these types of things, or we kind of identify, okay, here's the kind of difficult times, difficult locations, difficult routines that we need to provide some extra support around, positive coaching for our staff and be able to give them extra practice that they may need around those times. Okay, so the third bucket is the evaluation piece. And Laura touched around this, and kind of you always want to make sure that we're aware of what the policies are saying around how we document. But this is really important to think about how we're being proactive, because if we need to really look, especially at a system-wide level, around how are we reviewing our incident report data and our office data to kind of look at patterns, right? So kind of a couple of ways of looking at this is really kind of thinking about it as in a sense of time, location, and behavior, to kind of think about what's going on where and kind of have that data be able to figure out where to think about target support. But also it's really important to kind of disaggregate this data and kind of thinking about context variables and how we're supporting our students and our families, and bringing our families in and thinking about race, gender, and disability status, and seeing if there's any important data there that might help us with context, so we can really have a better understanding about engaging and making sure that we're responding in as much of an equitable way as possible. So it's very important to have our teams kind of look at these data and have some discussions based on this. So making sure that that's part of regular planful review. Regarding individual students, really kind of think about, again, time, location, behavior, preventatively, making sure that we're considering how we kind of can talk and have pre-identify what are some difficult routines for students and difficult times for students, so we can help the student and the staff with how we prevent those, right? So looking at that data frequently. In addition, kind of thinking about those positive practices that we have, whether it's universally or like a targeted support, or whether it's an FBA into a BIP, thinking about how we are using our data in a way that's really kind of directing towards supporting that student in a sense of kind of whether that is building upon a check and check out system with a daily progress report, and we use that with a little bit of coaching for that student, so we can kind of prevent, so a lot of these pieces I think are really important, but really looking at that data whether it's a system level or at an individual level in a disaggregated way is really an important feature. So putting it all together, family involvement is really critical here. And thinking about whatever tier you're talking about, really including families and some of and as much of the decision making as possible, and pretty much should be at every tier. So For instance, here, there's an example of, from Connecticut sharing out across all the students, like annual notices about restraint seclusion policy. Use that as an opportunity if parents or families have questions to bring them in and have those discussions. Laura talked about having kind of debriefing meetings with the students and families, and that's a great opportunity to kind of really understand context and really get a better understanding of what's going on and some of the resources and sharing resources with families as well. So think about those types of opportunities. As mentioned in the previous slide, Florida has some really nice resources for all students. So here's an example of that. So might want to pop over to their site and kind of get a sense of what they're sharing. And then, as always, thinking more and more about how best we can include families in this piece. Building positive relationships with families is one of the best things we can do. They are experts in their students and their kids, so we want to make sure that we're partnering with them as much as possible. So, a great example of this is in the state of New York has a human rights committee, and they've involved parents within that, and it's really nice just to have their input and understanding kind of the context of the families. So especially not, this could be done at a district level or also at a school level. But definitely we want to make sure that when we're working with students that we have partnerships with their family and we're trying to build that positive plan. So that's great. So I'm gonna leave you, but I kind of had two probe questions that I wanted to end on. One is I wanted to kind of, and you can kind of provide this in the chat, but what are some examples of technical assistance on restraint and seclusion that you are aware of? So I'm sure that in your districts, in your schools or different states, you have other examples that are probably equally as wonderful, and it would be wonderful to share. And the other kind of questions that we kind of talk about this more at the end is what are some other areas of technical assistance ideas for restraint and seclusion that you can bring back to your state and district and school? Thank you.
Adam, thank you so much. It's an invaluable resource. I hope that was helpful. And we really try to provide the kind of the full range of considerations from practices to policies to what would technical assistance look like as the output of those policies. Rachel, could you come off mute and share your camera? And then when you're ready, you can take control of my screen. And I'm really excited to have Rachel join us. Rachel and I have been having phone calls, I don't know, for 7 months or so, talking about a variety of things for support for the state. But really, I got an opportunity to learn about Rachel's experiences with PBIS, and she's going to kind of tell us a little bit more about her. Okay, Rachel.
Okay. Can you guys see me yet?
Yep, we can see you and hear you.
Okay. Well, I am Rachel Jenga. I'm with the Kentucky Department of Education. I am a PBIS ISF consultant. My title used to include restraint and seclusion. That is how I got here and got to work with Brian and Laura and Adam. I'm going to start with a little background. So let me there we go. The past 16 years or so, I worked in education. I worked as a special education teacher for the last 10 years and second grade teacher at the same school, Deep Springs Elementary in Lexington, Kentucky. I have been there from the bottom of PBIS to the end of them becoming a Gold Star school. So, seeing PBIS built from the ground up was an exciting thing for me, and being able to see the process that you think is never going to end, but then you see the things that happen from it. So, that was a very exciting time for me before coming to the department here in Kentucky. I worked in residential like Brian many years ago, so I've always had a passion for restraint and seclusion. I definitely think, with PBIS, I keep thinking about how if we train staff to de-escalation strategies and things like that, we can be able to move forward and lower these numbers. So I love being a part of this, and I appreciate Brian allowing me to do so. I have been, with the Department of Education a little over a year. So a little bit of school information about Kentucky. As you can see on the map, it says special education service regions. And the reason our state map, the way we look at it as PBIS consultants, we work with our special education service cooperatives. That is the people that we collaborate with most, and we're trying to build capacity across our state. And these are the people that we meet with monthly, and we are constantly trying to find new ways to get out there and get PBIS out there and help reduce those numbers of restraint and seclusion in Kentucky. There are approximately 1,233 public schools in Kentucky, and I say approximately because this is data from the 2018-19 school year from greatschools.org. 171 school districts, 648,369 students, and then 42,024 public school teachers in the state of Kentucky. Restraint and seclusion in Kentucky. In 2011, while monitoring developments at the federal level, the Kentucky Department of Education became increasingly concerned about reports of the use of restraint and seclusion in Kentucky schools. So in August of 2012, the Kentucky Board of Education had decided that, hey, we're going to have to do something about this. So they submitted a proposed regulation for public comments. So the public hearing was conducted in September, and comments were accepted till like October 1st of 2012. And then after that comment period and public hearing, I think it was around, October 3rd, 2012, the use of restraint and seclusion in public schools, the approved regulation went into effect. So on February 1st, 2013, we finally had a use of restraint and seclusion in public schools regulation. And you have to think, there was no regulation prior to this time in the state of Kentucky. So this was a big step for our state.
And I'm just going to share a couple of the highlights. I was so excited when I read this law, and then I was like, Rachel, aren't you from Kentucky? I'm really excited about this law and this policy you guys have going on. So she was laughing too across email. But they have a main regulation, which again, she had said that was the Board of Ed. So you have real educators are making this law. It includes definitions, which includes de-escalation, which I think is always really good to include in your definitions, not just restraint and seclusion. They provide data requirements for states, so it's clear what you have to submit. They include incident report details, so what you have to collect at the local school level. And they also share debriefing details for meetings. So again, some really good features on that. They also have a regulation for charter schools, which I think often we forget about charter schools, that this could also be happening. So they have actually said you have to make reports and provide training for staff for charter schools. And they also have a really good policy document. It's a seclusion and restraint frequently asked questions, and it describes the main law, which is always nice to kind of give that background, but it also goes into additional information. It addresses common questions that schools might have, such as connection of law with student and staff safety, which is a big concern. And then also provides details for the schools, such as where to input data. They've got a system. And then they also have, I think it looks like a model incident report form, which I think is awesome. And then this is just an example of what it is, and you can download it in the resource guide. So back to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Laura. This has been a really great project. And when you hear, the things that Laura has, been researching and all the data that she has, it kind of helps states be able to look at things a different way. I know for us, when I came into this position, quarterly data was something that, we had decided that, okay, this is what you have to do when you come here. And, I was thinking, oh my gosh, how do I aggregate data like this? So, one thing that you need to remember is when you look at these protocols, because that's what we did, we created a protocol to collect quarterly data. It can be ever changing. There might be things that you want to add, you do it one quarter and then you're like, what, we could add this too, because the more you dig into this data, the bigger the picture is. There is such an untold story with the data that after you start looking at it, you can be like, oh my gosh, you can almost see like the patterns and things across your districts and your schools. So the Division of Student Success, when you see DSS, that's where I work at the Kentucky Department of Education. We used student level data to create a state quarterly summary of restraint seclusion data report for restraint seclusion data report. We also use the student level data to do an internal review at a district level quarterly summary of restraint and seclusion. So we determined at first, let me say this, when I first came, there was a different protocol in place. So even with me coming on board, we added more things as a team. There was people throughout our department that came in and said, hey, let's change some things. Let's, look over this. And that is perfectly okay because it's ever changing. Everything in education is ever changing. So it is really important to understand that it's okay if, okay, you did it this quarter, but next quarter, let's try to do something else. So we looked at the number of restraints and seclusions. We looked at the number of students involved in an event. We looked at the number of events per students, events involving an SRO. We had demographic sets, which contain gender, grade level, socioeconomic status, English language learner status or English learner status, race, ethnicity, and disability status, types of disability. Well, once I'm a data person, so I started digging into that. I was able to see a whole lot more of what was happening, across our districts. And for me, it became an eye opener of, hey, it's not just us looking at this data and saying, oh gosh, these numbers are high. What can we do to support our districts and our schools? And, our PBIS team started brainstorming, like, how can we do this? What can we do? This is, us, we can, go to the schools or the districts and say, hey, let us support you, let us help you. And we work with our special education cooperatives during this time too. And we share the data with them and was like, hey, let's work collaboratively and try to support these schools and districts and get those numbers down. Just from experience of being here for over a year, I've learned a lot. I used Power BI was like my best friend during this time. I don't know if you've ever used that system, but that was my way of, making graphs and charts and looking at this data and comparing it across the quarters. And it was just interesting to see the numbers going up and down in the schools that really needed support or districts that really needed support, but, they weren't reaching out. So this was our way to say, hey, let us help you by, supporting you with PBIS or giving them really good research-based programs to help them lower these restraint and seclusion numbers. So my suggestion, just from our experience, was or is look at your quarterly data and look for those trends across your schools and districts. Look for the disproportionate numbers by race, ethnicity, disabilities, and special education population. Last year, I was able to attend the PBIS forum for my first time, and I learned how California was building capacity in their state and decreasing behaviors by using their various entities to train and support their districts. So in Kentucky, we worked closely with our educational cooperatives, and we've been doing those monthly meetings and discussing mutual work and how we can support one another. And we're making a really large training network here, and we reach out to each other to support each other, during anything that we're doing that's, with a school in their area or, a district in their area. And although restraint and seclusion has been moved back to the Office of Special Education and Early Learning, our department realizes that we can continue to increase supports and awareness through PBIS trainings, and our PBIS team can do that across our state, and we're figuring out how we can incorporate that with all of our trainings, because any of the PBIS trainings I've ever done or worked with, we didn't really target restraint and seclusion, and that's something that it's been an eye opener for me. Like, how could we educate? How can we train? So we're going to add extra segments in our PBIS trainings that will focus on the reduction of restraints and seclusions from here on out. We're going to continue to look at the schools that are implementing PBIS and compare the restraint and seclusion data and see if by implementing PBIS with fidelity reduces their restraint and seclusion numbers, and, just really kind of dig into how can we keep supporting these schools and get those numbers down. So what's next? The Office of Special Education and Early Learning will continue to follow protocols for restraint and seclusion. They were actually given a new grant, and they have a new program that's going to help them be able to look at schools a lot closer. And they are going to be producing trainings and training materials for staff throughout the state. New programs have been put into place to help with disproportionate numbers by race, disabilities, and all the main subcategories in special education. And they're going to be able to monitor specific districts and with disproportionality closely, And that restraint and seclusion data is going to help support their efforts in decreasing those numbers and the overrepresentation of the special education population regarding restraint and seclusion. Our PBIS trainings will have that more content that's going to focus on reducing restraint and seclusion, the importance of properly training staff. And that's, teachers, your support staff. I know a lot of times when we've had support staff come into our building, we're like, hey, this is your position. This is what you're going to do. You're trained in safe crisis management. And that's all they get, in a 5-minute spiel on de-escalation. So being able to come in and help with that's something that we really want to be able to do. We want to be able to support schools and staff and help them feel like they have the tools to, not be put in those situations. And like Laura said, imminent danger, is not the language we use, but oftentimes, the numbers are only as good as the data that's being put in. And so when you think about it as training staff and things like that, training on, data entry is so important, having those things in place, because you really can't see the story if the data isn't accurate. So, whoever's inputting your data, that's very important for your next steps as well. If we're training schools and districts to implement PBIS with fidelity, then it is our responsibility to include restraint and seclusion reduction in our trainings. And I really think that, with that, we, being able to see those numbers go down and being able to train more de-escalation strategies and more things, giving people more supports, we'll start to see those changes. So, but thank you guys.
Hey, Rachel, thank you. I think I was just reflecting on all of this information shared so far. I think in 60 minutes, 65, we covered quite a bit of range, the context, the MTSS framework, state policy and law, considerations for technical assistance. And Rachel, I think your willingness to share about the journey in the Kentucky Department of Ed, your personal journey too. I appreciate that. It's actually very hard to get individuals, organizations to talk about restraint and seclusion and to be accurate and honest with what's going on, which makes this subject challenging. So Rachel, you've been a champion for that. So thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, so Adam, maybe you could let us know, do we have any comments? I can switch over now myself, but any questions in chat? If or would folks want to still put those in there, we'll be happy to stay on for a few minutes.
Yeah, we're happy to stay on if folks want to put in the chat a question. I don't know if folks want to either, they could type it in the chat, or we could just have a conversation. I know that some folks were wondering where like different resources were for different states. And my thought was like, they can go to their different state websites and kind of try and identify through the different states like California. And I wasn't familiar with a lot of different states, just kind of the state that I live in.
For the policy documents we were talking about, I did list them by state. So you can kind of skim and see if your state does have some information in there. But really just going to the Department of Education websites for the states is really great. I mean, there was some stuff that we didn't pull, but I just saw, I think Kansas had some really good stuff on de-escalation. So there are really good resources out there at the state level, and really try to dig into them a little bit.
You can also call Laura on her cell phone and say, what's my state doing? That's my plan moving forward. Anything else? Anything else come to mind? If you haven't had a chance, take a look at the files pod. Again, that's where the SEA restraint seclusion resource table is that Laura shared. The TA brief is there. Also just posted last night, we shared the new CRDC data guide, or last report they have. That's 2017-18 data. But again, that's I think a really good resource too. And let me say this as we wrap up. when the Chicago Tribune published their investigative journalism about the state of restraint and seclusion in Illinois, and we took an opportunity to meet with our coaches around the state. We have coaches networking meetings here, and we provided resources. We shared some of the information we've shared today, but we also created a survey for them, and we said, tell us if you in your school are using the PBIS framework to address restraint and seclusion, and if so, would you be willing to talk to us about it? Keeping in mind that this was the choir. These were our coaches all over the state, a couple hundred different coaches in different districts. We had probably 3 or 4 responses. That was it. And I share that again to be vulnerable about this subject. Again, thanking Rachel for her willingness to speak on behalf of her state. But we had coaches who said, our district will not let us talk with you guys about this subject, which is, I mean, I just found that so fascinating that they know they have this issue and they can see it in their data, but they're afraid to get into it. And it reminds me a little bit about the work on equity, which is for years we said if we accurately provide data to schools showing the disproportionate impact on students of discipline policies, then the districts would react. But in fact, districts will see that data and say, now we know, and they move on and they don't change their practices. And I think restraint and seclusion can be the same thing. And unfortunately, it stays that way maybe until there's, some catastrophic event that takes place. So, or that you have administrators and practitioners who are really tuned into this subject, like Adam said, and maybe you have a hands-off policy, and then they have to say, now how do we support that? But if you're listening and you are a school that, or a district, I should say especially, who does look at their data through the PBAS lens, we'd love to hear from you too. And we'd like to share with your data stories, and maybe that can help others. Adam, Laura, any final words from you guys?
No, this was great. I appreciate everybody coming on and having this discussion. So.
Okay.
Yep, same here.
All right. Rachel, Adam, Laura, thank you. Diane, thank you for being our tech assistant. We appreciate it. Everybody enjoy the rest of the forum, and we'll see you in another session.
Okay, I'm going to
Thanks.
go ahead and end the meeting now.
All right. Thanks, Di.